Good afternoon, viewers. This is me, Javed Malik, welcoming you to another episode of the Ambassador Dialogue. This is, of course, an initiative of the Ambassador Partnership, which is based out of London but has ambassadors from more than 34 countries around the world. In today's program, we will be speaking to the former British Ambassador, Mr. Charles Crawford, and we talk about the effectiveness of communication and speechwriting. So let me welcome Mr. Charles Crawford. Good afternoon, Mr. Charles Crawford. Let's start by discussing, of course, the communication strategy that every leader must have, and also then we move on to other topics. In your experience, of course, as a British ambassador in different countries, also as a speechwriter for many leaders, including the royal family, I'm sure you understand the importance of effectively communicating your message when you're engaging with governments or indeed the public at large. What would you say should be the main, thrust of conversations when engaging with their counterparts, especially for ministers?
Do you mean publicly or privately?
Initially, we can talk about, bilateral meetings or perhaps when they are sending out a message, and then we can talk about when they're speaking to the public.
Well, I think I've met a lot of leaders and I've seen them in action, and I've sat in with Tony Blair meeting presidents and all the rest of it. That's what you do. And so,
yeah.
And I think what's really hard to grasp if you're not a diplomat is, in a way, how simple these conversations are. When politicians are meeting each other, if the Prime Minister of UK is meeting the Prime Minister of Pakistan or the Foreign Minister of Canada or something, a lot of what they're doing is sort of sizing each other up. Is this person trustworthy? Can I do deals with this person? Is this person going to be around for long enough to be worth investing in? If you think, well, they're going to lose the election in 6 months, there's no real reason to try very hard. Yes. So a lot of it's quite personal at that very, very, very highest level. It's not really about the detail. It's about simply listening and seeing what big picture deals can be agreed. Are the Canadians with us on this one? Well, the Pakistanis probably with us on this one, but we may need to give them something on Kashmir next week at the UN. What's the deal here? And so I think at that level in private, it's really quite like that. And often it's, it's oddly personal. And so the briefing they have can be very simple. These civil service people pile up great thick, you must have seen them, you've probably even written them.
Yes.
Great thick piles of briefing. What the leader wants is 1 page of short notes. That's about it.
Yes. So the first point, as you mentioned, would be to look at who you're engaging with and whether they will be around for a long time, whether they have a future, you can engage with them on a long-term basis. And supposing that, we have overcome that obstacle and we've established that the person is there for at least 4 years, post an election. Initial, obviously, would be the targets that you want to achieve in that relationship. What would be your advice for prospective ministers and ministers in business at the moment? How should they formulate their engagement with their counterpart?
Well, I think you have to decide. I think this is very difficult. I think one of the big things to decide is tone. And I always talk about tone. What's the tone of the relationship going to be? Is it going to be close? Is it going to be businesslike? Is it going to be friendly? Is it going to be, look, I really love you in private, but in public, I'm going to have to say some tough things. One of the things that Kozyrev, the young Russian foreign minister, said to our British foreign secretary after communism ended in the Soviet Union was, no surprises. If something bad is going to happen, let me know first. What I can't cope with is hearing from the newspapers that Britain has done something we don't like. So I think those elements are very important. And once you've got that personal relationship sort of semi-agreed, and all politicians know that when it comes to it, if it's down to your own survival, you will betray that relationship because that's politics. Everyone knows that. But once that's clear, you can then start to talk about things like, what is it you really can't accept? And I'll tell you what I really can't accept. These are bottom lines for me.
Yes.
And once you've got the bottom lines clear, then you can start talking about the top lines and the opportunities. And is it going to make sense to work together closely? Or is it actually better to work together closely by pretending to disagree. That can come up
Yes.
sometimes. There's lots of tricks, basically. And I think once
So personal rapport, we often hear, that a leader X had a very good rapport with, a leader Y, and that really played an important role in how the relationship with the countries developed. You might have a very good substantial argument or a discussion, but if you can't effectively communicate it in a way that the other person understands, perhaps you're not doing a good service to your office. Do you think these personal relationships do matter in diplomacy?
They're completely vital. But they're subtle, like all personal relationships. And there's the issue of what the personal relationship is in public and what it is in private. And these days with Twitter and social media and all the sort of noise that goes on,
yes,
it's quite hard to have a good private relationship. I think, I mean, it's hard to tell, but probably it's harder because so much stupid noise is going on outside your office. And at any one time, the phone's ringing with someone complaining about something, so there's a sort of tension, if you like, between the need to build a relationship of getting something done, which probably means being rather slow and, patient and all those sort of diplomatic things, and the sheer pace of events.
Right. In moving on, in talking about speeches, which are mainly aimed at a larger audience, sometimes those that are present in the room, but in these days, as you rightly mentioned, through Twitter and social media, they can be seen around the world. So you, as an experienced speechwriter for royalty as well as world leaders, what would you say were your key points that you always felt were important, or the ingredients that you always made to make sure that a speech becomes a hit with the audience?
Well, I think you have to think about who the audience is, because sometimes there's always the audience on the day. You've always got to be a hit with them, because if they're miserable and booing, that's what everyone hears around the world. But if they're pretty happy, that's okay. But then you've got the foreign leaders, you've got the public opinion, you've got your own voters, and you've got history. And I don't think you should, forget history. History's what these speeches look like in 5 years and what they look like in 50 years are interesting questions. But again, I come back to the word tone. What is the tone you're trying to convey? And I think in public speaking, certainly in the Western, if I can call it the Western mode, there's a big emphasis put on confidence and, if you like, optimism. Are people hearing optimism and a certain confidence? That's how Boris Johnson did very well. If anything, he's overconfident and over-optimistic. But if you look at the great presidential campaigns of my lifetime, say John Kennedy, Carter, Reagan, Obama, Trump even, they all won because they seemed more optimistic than their opponents. Make America great again, whatever it is. But there's a sense of can do. And I think that goes quite a long way. Now, there are times when you need to channel that into something which may be very difficult. There's a conflict going on, or there's COVID, or there's some sort of disaster. And then the tone has got to have an underlying sense of confidence, but also a sense of control and a sense of resolve and a sense of discipline and a sense of maybe having to make some sacrifices.
Yes.
So once you've got the tone right and the audience right, then the words are pretty easy, to be honest. So the words aren't really a problem in a speech. It's actually the other things which are tricky.
And also, I understand that there are, of course, cultural connotations. You might find that in some part of the world, you have to be more, regimented, or perhaps stick to the script, if I can use that term. And in some cultures, we find that it's more off the cuff and more easygoing speeches that are more hit. Do you think that in your experience, which one of the two are more effective?
Well, I think in any given culture, a speech which works with that culture is probably quite efficient in that culture. And there are some cultures where, as far as I can tell, the role of the speech is simply to emphasize that the speaker is important and all the audience have to do is keep their eyes down and listen. It's all really about demonstrating, if you like, the power and greatness of the leader rather than communicating any great message. The message is just that. I am the boss. That's it. Whereas I think...
And you're here to clap. Everybody else is here to clap.
Yeah, they're there to clap. I mean, when I was in Russia after communism collapsed, there was a lot of stuff was on sale on the streets in Moscow. And one of my colleagues at the embassy bought a box set of records, vinyl records of Stalin's speeches. And one side of one record was applause. That's all it was.
Okay.
You know, it was pretty interesting. So I think that there's that cultural tendency, and that plays into things like humor and spontaneity. In some cultures, a leader who is funny and cracks jokes or has too much of a light touch might seem not to be serious enough to be a leader. Whereas in the West, I think, you know, and right up to and including the Queen, there's got to be an element of humor in public speaking, certainly for things like a dinner speech or a lunch speech or a state banquet speech, those sort of big set piece speeches. There's got to be a bit of humor.
Yeah. Humor plays an important role in some of the Western countries. And of course, as you rightly said, in some parts, it might be viewed as non-serious. Moving on to the diplomats, you know, of course, we've talked about the world leaders and, you know, ministers and prime ministers and, you know, presidents. You mentioned Trump and Obama. As an ambassador, yourself and of course me and many others of our colleagues within the ambassador partnership often have the responsibility of, you know, hosting national days or participating in some of them. You know, in some of them, we find the speeches are written down in the capitals and our colleagues simply read them out. That might be one way of doing it, but perhaps not very engaging with the audience. The other is where you engage a little bit with the audience. In your experience, both as an ambassador, as a diplomat, and of course, somebody who writes, you know, important speeches. Once again, for diplomats, what would be your advice as, you know, making a more effective and more interpersonal speech?
Well, I think the difference between a diplomat, if you like, and an ambassador, say, and a politician, is that an ambassador is a guest in someone else's house, and you may not like their curtains or their cooking.
Yes.
And you can probably say that to them in private. What you will not do well is to say that in public if you want to stay as a guest in the house. So I think an ambassador making a National Day speech or any other speech really has to be, you know, in a way more sensitive to the local audience than perhaps a politician would need to do, because it's a different sort of relationship. A visiting politician can turn up in a country and say what they like and go home again, whereas the ambassador is there. You know, you have to deal with people. So there's a bit of that. I think most National Day speeches are terrible. Everyone knows this. But I think you can write really, really good National Day speeches, which have a certain dignity, which have a certain, you know, authority, but also a bit of light touch. Everyone likes a bit of light touch. And I helped actually a Polish diplomat write his National Day speech. And it was in May, I think, was the National Day speech. And it had a bit of light touch, but it had a bit of some serious messages. It said a lot of positive things about Poland. And at Christmas, he got a letter, I think, from his Christmas card from the American ambassador saying, yours was the best National Day speech of the year. Now it's not difficult.
It's a tribute to you as well, you know, how you structured it.
Well, sure, but I think what was interesting about that one was he had to let go. He had his sort of instructions, the sense of it from Warsaw. But if you say to Warsaw, look, you know, in the country I'm in, it's got to be done a little bit more like this. They won't care after all. They really want is they're just doing their job. They've sent you the instructions. It's up to you how you then implement them. Yes. So I think, you know, there's no reason for National Day speeches to be terrible, even though something like 99% of them are actually terrible.
Yes. I totally agree with you. You know, in my own role as an ambassador, I often received the speeches from the capital. And of course, one has to incorporate some of those elements into your speech, but I always improvised and, you know, adapted with the country where I am in sort of, I can, you know, relate more to them or they can relate more to me. And of course, I can still convey whatever is being conveyed to me by my capital in a more culturally, you know, acceptable way in the country that you're in. So totally agree with that. The viewers, we are talking to Charles Crawford, who's a former British ambassador and of course writes for various world leaders for their speeches. We'll take a short break. And when we come back, we'll talk about Brexit and how it is going to be important, not only for the British public, but also how Britain seems to, you know, will develop their engagement, not only with Europe, but also with the Commonwealth. We'll take a short break and then we'll come back. Well, thank you very much, Ambassador Charles Crawford, for that interesting discussion. Viewers, this brings us to the end of this discussion. And I hope to see you again in our next episode of the Ambassadors Dialogue. Until next time, this is me, Javed Malik, wishing you all a very good day.
The Ambassador Partnership. Access, Engagement, Resolution.